Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the Shema podcast. The episode I have lined up for you today is going to be one that I know there'll be points in my life where I'll want to go back to it and listen to it again. And it's fitting based off several of the episodes we have done recently. We had Rabbi Ken Spiro on to discuss what is the Torah. And he eloquently explained all the events that occurred at Mount Sinai and how the oral Torah was transmitted, ended up in the Talmud. But he summed it up nicely, quoting Maimonides, saying that the Torah is the 613 mitzvos and how to apply them. And then on the last episode, I had Rabbi Podowitz and Rabbi Sasson on to discuss their book, The Science Behind the Mishnah. And they were discussing the necessity of understanding the world around us in order to learn how to apply the Torah. So the question emerges, and that is, why, when reading the written Torah, what is the purpose of all the narrative? If it's about the 613 mitzvos and how to apply them, then just list out what we're supposed to do and how to fulfill it. Why do we have to learn about Adam and Chaya and Noah and Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the 12 sons, Yosef, Moshe, Aaron? What is the purpose of all this if the Torah is about the 613 mitzvos and how to apply them? And the answer is that the mitzvos are not the end goal. They are the means to the end. They are the means to the end goal of aligning ourselves to be in the image of our Creator, to develop that relationship, to be a vessel to fulfill His will in this world. And when you look at the stories of our patriarchs, they weren't easy lives. Matter of fact, they had the most challenging lives you can imagine. And that's what these narratives are there for, is to teach us how to navigate this world and develop our Emunah and our Bitachon. So starting with Avraham, I just want to use that as an example. He had 10 tests. All the forefathers, their life was just test after test after test. Avraham, his very first test, I was discussing this with the legendary Avi Roth, and we were discussing this idea, and I said, yeah, the first test was just a warm-up. And he said, yeah, pun intended, because his first test was gets tested by King Nimrod, who says, denounce this idea of there being one creator, or you're going to go into the furnace where you'll be burnt to death. So again, this is literally and figuratively the warm-up test. And Avraham goes into the furnace and Hashem saves him. Why is that the easiest test? I mean, it doesn't sound too easy at surface level, but Avraham was not married. He didn't have to worry about leaving his family behind. It'd be an excruciating death, and then he'd be returned his neshama back to his Creator. Now you fast forward to the 10th test, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, of Yitzchak. And if you think about that test that warranted us being the Jewish people today, is he had to go, for one, totally against his emotions. He was a paragon of chesed, of kindness, and Hashem told him to kill his son, who he loved the most. He had to go against all of his emotive qualities. But even more challenging, he had to go against his reason. Hashem had promised him a legacy, descendants. He had one son, and Hashem said, I want you to kill him. And it made, of course, no logical sense. This is sort of what Rabbi Brody was telling me a year ago. He said, Dan, it's time to get past the intellect. That's what Hashem's trying to tell you. Just move beyond the reason. At this level, I mean, he had to go against everything about himself. He had to go against his reason. He had to go against his emotions and accept the fact that he is a creation and he is not the creator. And you look at all the forefathers leading up to David HaMelech, one challenge after another challenge after another challenge. And that's what this is here to teach us. When it comes to this topic of Emunah and Bitachon, I came up with this analogy in my mind over the last year of an individual who decided, after a life of never been swimming and never being in a body of water, decided it's time. He wants to learn how to swim. He wants to know everything there is about swimming. So he gets all the greatest text, and he learns and he sits and reads and studies about how to be an incredible swimmer. Even when he's not learning, he's running errands, he's listening to lectures on how to be an incredible swimmer. He feels so confident with his knowledge of swimming, he starts giving lectures himself on how to be a great swimmer. But the gap is, as we can all understand, is that there is a difference between understanding something and knowing something. So what does Hashem do to help this man actually go from understanding swimming to knowing swimming? He orchestrates events, so he'll have to travel by boat. He'll create very tumultuous waves, and he'll cause the man to be knocked overboard. And when he's flailing in the water and screaming out to Hashem to help him, that's when Hashem will help him understand, take what you understand and now turn it into knowing. And that is how the man actually learns to know how to swim. We've all experienced this. We've like being thrown overboard. I've always wanted to speak to an expert on Emunah and Bitachon. And I will tell you, I know many people who are experts, but they became experts. They became masters of this, not by choice. And nobody would ever choose this. And I'm talking about friends I've known who have lost young children. It's beyond what we who have not had to go through something like this, and may God willing, we never have to go through it. We can't understand. And I look at it like if you ever have watched a documentary on Navy SEALs, like what they have to go through. It's like the toughest of the toughest go through this training. And they get to Hell Week, and they are being subjected to extremely cold weather, massive sleep deprivation, tremendous physical endurance and test. And the entire time, the sergeant's standing there by this bell and saying, whoever wants to quit in the pain, just come ring the bell. It'll be all over. And you see these toughest guys like, I'm out. And they ring the bell. You know, sometimes it feels like that in our Yiddishkeit, like it's Yetzirah, just like you can quit anytime. Just come ring the bell. But you see those who go through this and survive, and they are Navy SEALs. And when it comes to people that lost their children, they are the Navy SEALs of Emunah and Bitachon. But I would never have the audacity to reach out to someone and say, hey, would you mind coming on and teaching us by sharing the most painful, excruciating experience of your life? But I had someone reach out to me. As I mentioned the name already, Avi Roth, a legend here on the Shema podcast. We have today his son, Avi Roth. And he went through this really unimaginable experience. And he said he'd be willing to come on and share this story with us and everything he went through. And my friends, what you're going to learn from this is we all have challenges. It is by design. Again, Hashem's chariot, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, Joseph, David HaMelech, that represent the 10 Sephiros, they went through the most amazing, incredible challenges anyone could ever imagine. But that is what made them who they are. And so through this, if we can learn, what a Navy SEAL was able to endure, then we can take on our challenges with much more grace and learn from his experience to use those challenges to forge us into who we are intended to be in this world.
Welcome to the Shema Podcast, the podcast for the perplexed, where Torah insights, intertwined through personal stories, as well as interviews with leading Torah scholars, demonstrate the empowering qualities of Torah and mitzvot. For more great Torah learning through Torch, the Torah Outreach Center of Houston, go to torchweb.org. Now to the show.
Avi Roth, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dan, for having me. This is actually an honor of mine. As we had spoken earlier, a big fan of yours podcast, and it's my pleasure.
So to begin with, I want to dedicate this episode in honor of the memory of your daughter, Chana Ahuva, Toba Bas, Avraham, Cinder, Aaron. And may all the learning and the Emunah and the Bitachon that people develop from listening to this episode be an elevation for her neshama.
Amen.
So let's begin with you telling the audience about your life around that stage, maybe up to that sort of point to where you're married and your daughter, Hannah, is coming into the world, and bring us up to that point.
So when we discovered that we were pregnant with our first, she was our oldest. And from the start, the pregnancy had some complications, some questions about the health of the baby. But throughout the process of the pregnancy, we were told that they weren't really significant and that we shouldn't worry and that it would be okay. And we went about, there was continuous testing over the course of the pregnancy, including parts of genetics testing and ultrasounds of the baby itself. But we were reassured that everything was fine. That all changed the day that she was born, when they whisked her off to the neonatal intensive care unit right after birth. And that's when we discovered a whole slew of things that was undetectable, I guess, by neonatal testing. And only until she was born did it become clear that these were issues that had to be addressed. So she spent, we did not see her, except for the first few moments after birth, we did not see her for hours after the birth until they finally allowed us to come see her. And she didn't look like a regular baby. She had all kinds of stuff attached to her. She was in an incubator. We couldn't hold her. And as young parents in our 20s, we were thrown into a world that we had never experienced and never expected to experience. One doctor, even, this was the neonatologist who was in the room at her birth, had the beautiful bedside manner and said to us, "Your baby's funny looking." That was the first comment that he made about our baby when she was born. And anybody who knew her, she was a beautiful blonde hair, blue-eyed little girl. So definitely not funny looking. But we learned later that that's like a slang medical term that doctors who are not well-informed use.
Oh my gosh.
It was not great. It was not a great moment for him. But we slowly realized there were a lot going on with her with regards to her medical care that the hospital that we had birthed at was not equipped to handle. So we started the process of trying to get her transferred to a more, acute hospital that could handle her needs. The hospital was resistant. They felt that they could care for her. It was very clear they couldn't. But we did end up having her transferred to an institution that many people are probably familiar with, Columbia University Medical Center in Manhattan. She was transferred there actually on Yom Kippur of all days, which was a challenge in itself because I was davening in Lincoln Square Synagogue, which is in Manhattan on the West Side, and got word that they were going to be transferring her, ran to the rabbi who barely knew me and asked him, this is the question, should I go with the baby? She's like, no, the mother can go with the baby. You stay and you daven because that's the best thing that that could be for the baby is for you to stay here and daven. So me spending the entire Yom Kippur not knowing what happened, they ran with the baby to Columbia, and it was only then that we actually got the first diagnoses about what we were looking forward to for the next number of years. And that was that she had pulmonary hypertension. And just to I don't want to go into the whole detail of it, but just to give you a little synopsis, it's basically the lungs, they don't develop the way that everyone's lungs do. And the vessels, where the blood transfers to give oxygen to the body, are lower in number than a normal person. And therefore, oxygen levels are lower, and it affects the heart because the heart just wants to oxygenate the body. So it enlarges, and it's an ongoing battle. It's called pulmonary hypertension because there's hypertension in the pulmonary system. And it leads to all other complications with the body, like slow growth and other issues. But it really puts a stress on the lungs. It really puts a stress on the heart. And that was what we were up against. So once we got to Columbia, they intubated her, and she was there for an additional 5 weeks, at which point they allowed us to take her home on oxygen. And it became a series of in and out of the hospital for the remaining years of her life. But despite that, she was an incredibly bright, funny, smart, really just so smart little girl who didn't let her disabilities get in the way. We ended up transferring all her care to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which is where we spent most of the time. There was the top specialist in the world there for pediatric pulmonary hypertension. It's not a very common illness with children. It's more common in adults, so the research is not as extensive. But this particular doctor was very well-oriented in everything pulmonary hypertension, and he was the leader in pediatric pulmonary hypertension. So there are other places that have it, but we wanted the best for her, so we would travel out there often.
Is there a cure for this?
There's only treatment. Treatments come some way. Again, she passed in 2012. So in the time since then, they had treatments that she had, which include oral treatments that would help to dilate or open up the vessels that she did have in her lungs to allow for greater blood flow. She also had a medication that she wore on her back, a pump that she would wear on her back that ran 24/7. It could never be stopped. And that medication went directly to her heart and would pump on a continuous small rate so that it would keep those vessels open, continuously. And it was through a central line, which had to be monitored very closely. And she had that from about 3 years old until her passing. And they've come a long way with that.
How old was she when she passed?
She was almost 5.5, almost. Yeah. So now you could deliver that same medication through subcutaneous route. You don't have to do it central line like it used to be. But
so tell us about Chana Ahuva. Tell us a little more about your daughter and the time you spent, just so the audience could sort of understand what a special young woman this was.
Right. So from a very early age, you wouldn't even know she was sick, right? If you looked at her, you saw nothing. You saw just a beautiful face, a happy kid, and there was never anything that indicated that she wasn't well. In fact, a friend of mine who came to Shiva, he was in shambles, in tears, because he said, I didn't know that I knew she was sick. You told us, but you didn't see it. You didn't know it. So and that's the way she carried out every day. So she would keep up with her siblings. She would run around. She would go to school, but she had this chen, this kindness, this sweetness that enveloped everybody that she came in contact with. They used to say at CHOP in Philadelphia, in Children's Hospital Philadelphia, she was the rock star of the unit, because whenever she was hospitalized, she would walk around the unit with her IV pole, and if there was a baby crying in a room, she would run to the nurses station and tell the nurses that they had to go into this room because there was a patient, a baby crying, and maybe the baby's hungry. So she was always about looking out for others at a very young age, even. So she has a sister that's just 1.5 years younger than her, and this is a really, really great. And it had such an impression on the pediatrician that even when he came for Shiva, he recalled this story. And I remembered it well because I was there, and it was mind-boggling. So we went with at the time, my 1.5-year-old. So Chana Ahuva was almost 3 or about 3 years old. We went to get immunizations, right? Vaccines for the younger one. And again, Chana Ahuva was not the one getting vaccinated. She was just in tow because we had to get her sister vaccinated. When the doctor pulled out the needles for her sister, she knew it wasn't for her. She knew. She got in the way of the doctor giving her the shots. She wouldn't let the pediatrician give her the shots because she didn't want her to, and she was very verbal about it. Like, no, you're not giving her. She's going to cry. I don't want her to get pain. I don't want her to have any pain. And it was like, and the doctor, who, again, he came to Shiva, he said he, in all his years of practice, had never seen that before, where a sibling would jump in the way of their sister so that they wouldn't have to go through the pain of having the shots. And, she was too young to understand what the shots were for, obviously. But that was always the way she was, always putting, and it sounds crazy, but she was an old soul in that way.
I'm thinking the whole challenge of life was you come into this world and you're egocentric, you're an infant, everything's about me, feed me,
right.
Do this for me. And then we go through a life, and God willing, if we're lucky and we're successful, we learn how not to be selfish and think about others.
Right.
Sometimes it's like if we're 40 years old and we're still working on this, right?
So true.
And here's this little girl that's
and
right out of the gate is already at that level.
Yeah, in some ways, when I reflect back, I look at it as like, wow, she was really maybe her life was in fast forward. You know what I mean? Like, because she was able to accomplish those things so quickly and at such a young age, things that I think I'm still struggling with, that it almost like, okay, she didn't need to be here longer than that because she was so selfless. And so, I mean, even small things, like if she would get a lollipop in shul from the candy man, she would make sure to grab one for her sister too, because she didn't want her to, if her sister wasn't there with us. It was always like putting others before herself continuously. And I think all my siblings and my parents can attest to that she was just that way. She was very kind and sweet. And again, this is a girl who did not have it easy. I mean, she was literally in the hospital dozens and dozens and dozens of times over the course of those 5.5 years. And again, she walked around in the last 2.5 years strapped to this pump that was on her back. She was not allowed to take a shower because of that pump. We had to, sponge bathe her very carefully. And she couldn't go swimming. She loved the pool up until 3 years old. She couldn't go in a pool, not for lack of trying. We even had someone commissioned to try to make a waterproof suit that could house the pump. It never worked, but we tried. But yeah, and despite all of that, you wouldn't even know it. Like, she was just such a happy, happy little girl. So that's what I remember most about her. And this is worth noting, because we just had the Parshas Yisro, and we did the Aseres Adibros, and in it we learn about Kibbud Avayim. And it's also one that, is not an easy one at times in your life. But Chana Ahuva, for some reason, I don't know what it was, that she, a kid who's 3 or 4 or 5 years old, if you walk in the door and they're watching, if they have screen time, or they're playing a game, or they're coloring, that's what they're doing. They have no regard for the fact that their father or mother just walked in the door. But not Chana Ahuva. I mean, she had like her shows that she loved to watch. She loved Barney. I know that's a shot from the past, but she loved Barney. She loved this cartoon called Caillou. But she would get engrossed. She would sit there and she'd watch it. But as soon as the door opened and she saw it was me or her mother, she would run and give us a hug and a kiss and want to spend time with us. It was like that was a very unique thing that I thought, you love your children, but that's something that kids just don't do. They're
for sure. Amazing. I was reading a book not too long ago on reincarnation. It was sort of talking about how like you have these sages that come in the world and they're drawing a blank on their names, but they're like at age 3, they're no olive Homish, right? And at 5, and they're and they're like by 12, they're giving dissertations. It's like, but they were sort of talking about these different levels of the soul, and the highest one, they said like that has to come in the world, and that's like egoless. And it has to come in and do a final purification. And it's at this state of total egolessness, and there's no selfishness to it whatsoever. And when you were talking about Chana Ahuva, I was like, that sounds like exactly what I was reading about.
Yeah, there's a great story. I don't know if you want to hear it. It's a little bit, it'll take a few minutes to tell, but it's incredible, incredible story. So it happened to me, and it was something that was very meaningful, because until that point, no one had ever said to me anything with regard to her passing that really gave me this kind of comfort that this did. I was working at the hospital. It was just a regular night, and I was asked by one of the nurses there if she wanted chocolate. And I was always known as the guy who had like junk on him, So I said, I actually don't have, but we have the kosher room on our unit. And I said, you know what, let me check the kosher room. I had permission from the ones who run the kosher room that if ever there was a nurse that was working with the kids, needed something, that I could bring them to them. So I went into the kosher room to go look for some chocolate. And sitting at the table in the kosher room was Rabbi Zecharia Wallerstein. Rabbi Wallerstein he had an organization called Or Nava, where he would take troubled girls, teens from different backgrounds, and give them himself like a safe haven, somewhere where they could learn, they could study. He also was very involved in kiruv, and kiruv of more troubled teens was his like focus. But he became this like larger than life figure. You could find his speeches and stuff all over the internet. I mean, he's all over YouTube. He's all over Torah. Anytime, I believe he's on YU Torah as well. And he's the way he speaks, he's very abrupt. He's very Brooklyn, but he's fascinating. And the stuff he says really hits home whenever you listen to him. Anyway, I had been for lack of a better word, I would have been a chassid of his, a follower of his for a while. Loved his his little tidbits. People would send videos, and I walked into that room, and there he was sitting there. I was like, what? Was a story within a story. Just an hour and a half before that, I had been driving to work, and my wife called me, and she said, Avi, my mom's on the phone. She wants us to go to this Shabbaton in 2 weeks at this hotel. She'll pay for it. Would you want to go? I said, well, what's the Shabbaton? So she said, Rabbi Wallerstein has the Shabbaton for his Ornava organization, and he opens it up. It's it's a way for them to raise money. Would you go? I said, that's that weekend. Actually, that's the weekend we're going away, because I had a yeshiva in Israel. We do like once a year. We did anyway. We don't do it anymore. But we would gather together once a year, like almost like a reunion Shabbos. So it's the same Shabbos. So I said, unfortunately, I can't go, but your mother should go without us. It sounds great. Anyway, so we'll go back to our story within the story. So I walk into the coach room. There's Rabbi Wallerstein. I'm like, what? So I said to him, you're not going to believe this. He sticks out his hand to me because he sees me in the scrubs, right, with my badge and whatever. So he says, oh, Shalom Aleichem, I'm Zachariah Wallerstein. I said, no introduction necessary. I know exactly who you are. I'm a big fan. I said, but what's crazy is that just an hour and a half ago, I was talking about you. He's like, talking about me? What were we talking about? So I said, not bad, I promise. I said, you have a Shabbaton coming up in a couple of weeks. He says, yeah, you're coming? I said, actually, I can't. And I explained to him why. And he said, well, so I said to my mother-in-law might go, though. And he took down her name. He wrote it down. He's like, I make sure she comes over and says hello to me. And then he starts talking to me, engages with me. And he's talking about why he was in the hospital and what was going on. It wasn't about him. It was about a relative of his that was in the emergency room. And he was asking me questions about it. And while we were talking, in walked a gentleman whose sister was an inpatient on our unit, a young woman who was waiting for a heart transplant and a kidney transplant. She was 21 years old. She had had a transplant when she was much younger, and now she was coming back because she was in heart failure. In any case, he sees Rabbi Wallerstein. He says, can you please come and speak to my sister? She's very depressed. She's been in the hospital a long time. She would really get a kick out of having you come and give her some chizuk. He goes, if she wants me to come, I'll come. But if you're asking me to come, I'm not going to come. So he says, all right, let me go find out. So he runs out. He comes back a few minutes later, says, yeah, she wants to talk to you. So I said, great. So now Rabbi Wallerstein says to me, please walk me to her room. I want to talk to you. I said, okay. So we're walking to the room, and he says to me, you got to tell me your story. He's like, you're a male, you're from, right, Orthodox Jewish nurse in a pediatric hospital. There's got to be a story there. So I said, you really want to hear my story? Because it's not a great, it's not so happy. It's not going to have a happy ending story. So he says, no, tell me your story. So we're walking to the room, and I said to him, I actually just got back from my daughter's yard site. She's buried in Israel, and she passed away some number of years ago. And I explained to him how that led me to be where I am today in pediatric cardiology nursing. And he was floored by it. He's like, I can't believe that. He says, you know what? And at this point, we're outside this young woman's room. He says, don't go anywhere. I'm not done with you. So he goes in the room. He has a conversation with her. He comes back out, and he says, walk me to the elevator. So I'm walking to the elevator, and he says to me, he goes, have you ever heard of the Arizal? So I said, sure. Arizal is one of the most famous names in Kabbalistic Torah, and who, by the way, also did not live very long. So we know that his purpose was very short, and he only lived to about 36 or 38 years old. But I said, and about the Arizal, he said about himself that Rabbi Chaim Vital, who his closest Talmud, that was the reason why he was here on this earth, was to give over Torah to Rabbi Chaim Vital. So when Rabbi Wallerstein heard me describe that, he said, good, perfect. So now I know that you can appreciate what I'm about to tell you. And he told me that Rabbi Chaim Vital, which he saw in writing himself, Rabbi Wallerstein saw this in Rabbi Chaim Vital's sefer. I don't know which sefer, so that I can't tell you. But he wrote in it that when neshamos were coming back after having lived their lives here on the world, and they came to Shemayim, and they came before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and these neshamos were very lightly tainted, right? They didn't have terrible averos that they had to atone for. They were slight. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to them, you have two choices. One, you can go into Gehenna, you can go into hell here, or you can be reborn. And they said, well, we don't want to be reborn. We've done so well. Like, we only have a little bit to clean up. We'll take our chances. We'll go into hell. We'll clean ourselves up, and we'll stay here where we already lived our lives. So God opens the gates to hell, and they, whoa, we're not going in there. No way. And so then God said to them, well, then you know what your alternative choice is. So they said to God, well, then what reassurances do we have that we won't come back with more to fix than we already have now? So then God said to them, again, this is Rabbi Chaim Vital writing this, not me saying it, not Rabbi Wallerstein saying it. He says, then in that case, I will make sure that you neshamos won't live past your bar and bas mitzvah. So you won't be responsible for any of the bad that you do. You won't have lived to the age which is called a bar chayuva. You'll just have been short of it, and so it won't be on you. So they said, okay, that's a good answer. But what about our parents? Our parents, they're meant to suffer by having a child pulled and ripped away from them at such a young age. So again, God said, you're right. That's a really good taina or claim on me. So in that case, I will give you this, that when your parents reach their age and they come to Shemayim, they come to heaven, you will be waiting for them. And you will take them by the hand without judgment and pull them with you into Gan Eden. So that's what Rabbi Wallerstein turns to me and says to me. And I said to him, it's like, wow. I said, at this point, I think my daughter had been gone 5 years. I said, people have told me all sorts of things that they hoped would give me some kind of relief, some kind of feeling of nechama. But I said, this is the first time someone's told me something that really, really, really helps,
Yeah.
And I said, and it goes to what you're talking about. That's all. But
beautiful. Amazing. That's the difficulty of this life. We know everything Hashem is doing for the good. It's just sometimes when you're in the situation, you can't see the good. So let's go back. I want to go back to before Chana Ahuva has passed. One of the things you share with me offline is your prayers. If you're okay sharing that with the audience, because it really, when you were sharing me with what your prayers were like, you had such clarity that I think a lot of us need to be reminded of.
Yeah. So one of the things that Chana Ahuva woke up in me was, until she came into my life, I think that maybe like many people, material items meant something. And what she made me realize is how little those really mean. And on multiple occasions, just when you purchase something new and you want it to be, you're so excited about it, and you don't want it to get ruined, and you're taking such good care of it, and then you look over and you see there's this beautiful little girl who's suffering with all kinds of things, and it's like, it really puts in perspective that this is so unimportant. But when she was very ill and near death, in particular, is when I prayed that to Hashem, and I said to him, I said, if you would take anything you want from my material life, I don't need anything. I'll live on the street. I don't want to take whatever it is that most people find important, but just leave her with me. Don't take her from me, because that's too much. That would be too much. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. But that was prior to her passing. Those were like the focus of my tefillos, of all my prayers, was that, like, I don't care about everything else. Just make her healthy. Leave her here with me. Let the results of this test come out positive.
When you mentioned that story to me last week when we were chatting, it reminded me of something that happened like a year ago, where, when I'm driving somewhere with my wife, Elisheva, like, I'll have like the Apple Siri, like with the directions, the GPS, and I always mute it. Cause like, I don't need Siri to sit there and say, turn right, turn left, do this. But when my wife's in the passenger seat, it's like I have Siri Elisheva, like, speed up, slow down, get in this lane, turn right. You should have gone that way slower. And one day I was looking at my phone at the stoplight. She's like, what are you looking at your phone for? I was like, because I'm trying to look for the mute button to Siri Elisheva. So to eliminate and mute Siri Elisheva, what I started doing was, like, whenever we go somewhere, I was like, you drive. Just, I'll sit in the passenger seat. And that ends it. So like a little over a year ago, I just got a brand new car and got a little more sporty edition, which sort of screams. Dan's 55. He's having a hard time dealing with it. And she drives, and at the house we were renting, as she's pulling up, we had a park in the front of the house, and because her car was in the garage and we couldn't fit two cars in there. And she's pulling up in front of the house. I just hear the brand new rims just like, scraping against the concrete. And she's like, "Oops, oh well." And, like this brand new car with these beautiful rims. And I get out of the car and I'm like looking at them, and she's walking around. She's like, "Oh, did I scratch your rims?" Like, "Yeah." She's like, "Oh, you can just buff them out." And I'm like, "You can't buff out rims." And then I walked around the car because she had driven a few other times. And then like, they're all like, they've been through a meat grinder. And I'm like biting my tongue, and I go into my office and I'm like just fuming, just like, "You should go say something to her. Like, what is wrong with you? How do you not know how to drive? Like, I had this car in less than 2 weeks and you destroyed my rims." But then I caught myself and I realized, like, wait, hold on a second. Are you really going to go make your wife feel bad because of rims? Like, really, what is more important to you? Like, are you that big of an idiot that the rims are more important to you than your wife? And I finally like caught myself and sort of laughed about how ridiculous of a turmoil that is. Like, that I was like in this challenge, like rims, wife. I don't know. It's silliness. And when you shared that heartfelt story about when it comes down to it, how insane it is that we would prioritize some earthly possession over the greatest gifts we have, which is the people Hashem puts in our life. And I think you say it so well that brings it into clarity for all of us.
But I mean, I think, Dan, that we have to remember we are human. And I think even now I still have moments, there are things that are materialistic that I still do cherish and I care about. And because I'm human. I'm human.
Right. Yeah.
But I do know, like, if so, like oh my God, I can totally see that story was like, we also just got a new car, so I know exactly the feeling. But yeah, and also I don't think you're the only one with an Elisheva navigation system. Any of us have that. But I think it's also about, like you said, yeah, maybe in the moment you're upset about whatever it is, but then if you can quickly bring yourself and bring perspective, then that's just as important. It's not that you're always going to be this like lofty person who doesn't have feelings about worldly things. We live in this world. That's just the way it is. But that at least you can keep yourself in check. And I just to share this, and this just shows, and this is really calling myself out. But when Chana Ahuva was 3.5, we had bought and then it was like brand new to have flat panel TVs. I mean, this is going back. We used to have tubes, and now this was like the first time we purchased a flat panel TV, and it was new to her too. And she took a crayon and colored all over that screen because, but it wasn't TV. It was a it was
a coloring board.
It was exactly a coloring board, right? So crayon on the entire thing, and this is one of her healthier moments in life. So I want to just preface that with that. I walked in and I saw this TV and I was like, oh my God. And I got really upset. I scolded her and I said, we don't color on this. How could you color on this? It's brand new. And I think we were making payments on it. Like, it wasn't like,
Right.
And then she cried. She cried. And I cried too. I said, oh my God, this poor child finally had a moment of happiness where she was coloring. Yeah, okay, it was on this really expensive TV. And her father yelled at her and made her cry over something so stupid, so insignificant as a television. And I actually never forgave myself for that, even till today. And I want you to know, we still have that television. It's one of the things that I cherish. It's in our basement it's plugged in. It's hanging on the wall in the basement. Now by our standards today, it's a 32 inch. It's tiny, but all the crayon is off of it except for one spot in the bottom, which still has crayon written on it that I won't let anyone. If the cleaning help comes, I make sure to instruct them not to touch that, because I can always reflect back on and how I was and what I did and how to keep myself in check. So it's just like a side story, and it really throws me under the bus on that one. But I feel like it's important to.
Yeah, for sure. Hashem throws us curveball situations just to remind us where our priorities are. So I think that's a very powerful lesson. I want to, not to have you sort of rehash the painful part, but I do want you to sort of share, she passes, like what was going through your head? Because, were you angry at God? I think that's understandable. And I think he would understand that. And how do you move past that? Like, where it's just like, why would you do this to me? You give me this beautiful little girl and you take her from me? Like,
right. Yeah. So what you describe is only like a fraction of what I felt. Here we are, remember, 5.5 years of doctors, surgeries, hospitals, our lives surrounded by her care, and then he plucks her away from us. And I was really angry. I was really upset. And I almost remember thinking to myself, I'm like, I'm gonna go daven, but do I even mean it? Like, what's like you just took the most precious thing away from me, someone who I fell in love with for 5.5 years, and then boom, just like that, taken away, and I'm supposed to daven like everything's okay, like I'm just gonna move on with my life. It was, I had to say angry would be an understatement, I think, at that point. But someone said something that was really poignant at Shiva, who had themselves lost a child early on. This was an older gentleman too. He lost many years before. And he described his relationship with his wife after the passing of their child, that she would walk around the house just after the passing. And she would constantly, this was like her mantra after the passing, she would say, God is an Indian giver. God is an Indian giver. And she would say this over and over and over again for, I don't know if it was days or weeks, and finally one day her husband, he couldn't handle it. He couldn't handle hearing her going on and on about God being an Indian giver. And he said to her, sweetheart, imagine for a minute that somebody were to give you the most rare diamond in the world, and they ask you to watch it for them. You can show it off. You can prance it around town. You can do whatever you want with it. But at some point, I'm going to take that back. Would you have rather not have had it at all? God gave us this gift for however many years he did. Yes, he took it back. But would you have rather never had that gift at all? And when I heard him say that to me, it did put a new spin on it.
Yeah.
Wow. And my Rav, to add to it, my Rav here in Muncie, who I've really leaned in on at that time, he said to me, something you should know about your daughter is that and they say this about all special needs children, that in general, children who are well, God chooses the family for which that child will be born. He chooses the parents that will be best for that child. But when it comes to a special needs child who has needs that are beyond what a normal raising of a child looks like, that child chose the parents. And so my Rav said to me, he said, remember that. She chose you. She wanted you. And those are some of the things that I carry with me, that she was a gift to us, for even if it was a short, abbreviated amount of time. But I would never be we mentioned this to you previously when we spoke, that I would never be what I am today had it not been for her in my life. So I owe her so much in that short time that I was given that with her. But she chose us. She added to my life that I can never even repay her for. But that's a huge part of how I am able to get past the anger that I had toward Hashem, or toward, because it wasn't, and I think we mentioned this also, that when I was going through that period of time, and it was so bad and it was so horrible, that I thought that this is just, how can I ever get past this? And now we fast forward to now, and I look at it, I'm like, oh, wow, that was just one little patch on a tapestry, right? And that now I can see the bigger part of the tapestry. Obviously, the whole tapestry is not written yet. That'll be at the end of my life. But from then to now, I can see how it was so perfectly woven in to my entire life, and that it had to happen. You know, I always refer to that part of my life as a wheel, and that I was at the bottom of the wheel trying to get back to the top. But I don't know if I'm at the top right now, but I know that I'm not at that bottom. And then I could never foresee getting to the top. You know, it's almost like it was like a hamster running on a wheel and it goes nowhere. But I think it comes down to baby steps and day by day, getting past that initial shock and anger, and realizing that. Also, one of the big things I realized was that when you look around the world today, and those who don't have a religion or something that grounds them, I don't even know how they get past the loss of a child. If you have no idea that there's something beyond what you have here, that there's something greater, then it's impossible. It's an impossible feat.
Yeah.
But knowing that there's something much greater.
Yeah, 100%. I don't know how people survive and are able to navigate the world without having Torah in their life, because nothing would make sense. I would like to sort of go through the timeline, because you mentioned how you now see, looking back, how that event led to the overall tapestry of your life, that everything sort of comes together. But I want to go back to that period when you were sitting Shiva, because I've talked to a lot of people who have lost young children, and some people out of ignorance say things that are not helpful on what to say. But I want to first begin with some of the things that were very positive, the people that had said things to you in that moment that really helped you.
Yeah. So going back to my Rav, for example, so he told me that the first time he met her, this was it really warmed my heart. So when we first brought her home, we couldn't really travel long distances with her. And at the time we were living in Brooklyn. So it wasn't until she was about, I'd say around 5 months old, before we traveled to Muncie to my parents' house with her. And upon my father's insisting, we arranged a meeting with, his name is Rabbi Schlesinger, Rabbi Yisrael David Schlesinger, who I was close to even back then, to come to the home on Saturday night to meet Chana Ahuva for the first time. So he came in with his shamash, his right hand man, and I was holding Chana Ahuva, and Chana Ahuva was just 5 months old, and the two of them came in together to the living room, and they locked eyes, the two of them. It was a very unique, weird vibe in the room. Not normal for a 5-month-old to lock eyes with anybody, let alone for what seemed like an eternity. It must have been a good 2 minutes where no one spoke, and the rabbi and her were just staring at each other. And then finally he broke it, the rabbi, and he gave a bracha to her. And then he asked me if I had made a kiddush for her, which I had not at that point. He said, you must make a kiddush for her as soon as possible so that people can wish her mazel tov and whatever. It'll be good for her. Anyway, he's sitting now, we fast forward to Shiva, he's sitting there and he recounts the Rav, the first time he met her. And he told me something that he had never shared before. And he said that when he looked at her, he saw her neshama on her face, that there was a purity that he saw when they were staring at each other. And he's a pretty holy man. He's you can ask around about him, Rabbi Yisrael David Schlesinger. He's not someone who lives his whole life on our world, but he said that he actually initially insisted that go onto her tombstone, onto the kever, but we did not put it on there. But it just verified how I felt about her, that she was this purest person. She came in pure and left pure. But that was very strengthening for me when he said that. Some of the other great things I shared with you, I think also in our previous conversation, that one woman who came, she sat and described, this is not, again, I want to be clear, this is not my Torah, like I didn't create this. This is from her, but she said to me that the best way to describe the loss of a child, and I think we can extrapolate it to any loss of somebody that we're close to is that in that moment of loss, your whole world is dark. I remember even going outside during Shiva to get some fresh air and watching people driving on the street and thinking to myself, I know this is just so crazy. If you don't experience it, you won't understand it. But watching them drive, I'm like, do they have any idea that I lost my daughter? Do they even know the pain that I'm going through? They're just driving, going around their business, running their errands, like nothing ever happened, and I'm suffering so bad
Right.
here. And so she said to me, "Yeah, your whole life is a dark room. There's no light in it. Everything is just crumbled. You can't even imagine that there's ever going to be anything to look forward to ever again. And what you'll find is that with time, small cracks will form in that room and little streams of light will puncture the darkness. And slowly over time, maybe it'll take years and maybe it'll take months, but over time, that room will get all the light. It will be filled with light. But there will always be one corner of that room that will remain dark, and that will be your loss. And you'll always be able to go to that corner. You'll be able to experience the loss. You'll know it's there. She'll always be part of you. But life has a way of allowing you, and it's really a chesed that Hashem has given us, that our minds can heal and we can process and we can put things into our, there's long-term memory. Because if everything was kept in our short-term memory, we truly would not be able to move on. We wouldn't be able to function. It's really a blessing. But so that's how it is. I mean, I always say that her yard site, right? Her Memorial Day is the day when I allow myself to be most vulnerable when it comes to remembering her. But every day something pops in my head about her. I don't think there's a day in my life that there isn't something that I think about with her.
So you touched on, you mentioned that when you look back now, you see how this tapestry of your life, how this was so essential. Tell the audience about how this entire experience caused you to take a total 180 change in the trajectory of your career and the type of livelihood you wanted to have.
Yeah, it's a complete 180. So I started off, my first college degree was in business and finance. I was hoping to get into marketing, and I'm a little bit of a creative person and love arts and crafts kind of stuff. And so marketing seemed like a pretty natural progression. And I'd worked for three telecommunication companies, and it ended up just being in finance. It wasn't really any marketing when my daughter was born. And I suddenly came to realize that being in a cubicle punching numbers for a huge corporation was maybe not the best suited profession choice for me. And after I was working for the third company, 2008 hit. And in 2008, everyone who was in adulthood at that point would remember that everything crashed. Not just mortgages, but pink slips were being given out by the dozen. And I was not immune to that. And so I received my first ever pink slip from a company I was working at in Florida from remotely in New York. And I right then decided that having watched Chana Ahuva being cared for in the hospital through all these hospitalizations, that I wanted to do something to kind of give back and be part of that. Because these people looked that as though they were happy, they felt like they had meaning, and I wanted to be part of it. And watching my daughter herself and how she cherished the nurses in the hospital. I mean, there was times when she wouldn't even look at us after a procedure. She would only want the nurse. She almost felt like we betrayed her and that the nurse was there to take care of her and comfort her. So that's when I decided that I was going to go into the field of nursing. And it was, like I said, quite a change. I didn't have any of my prerequisite courses that I needed. I didn't have any sciences under my belt. And so I had to start at the beginning. I did end up getting into an accelerated nursing program because I did have a degree prior. So that did shorten it a little bit, but that goes back quite a bit now. Unfortunately, she never saw it to fruition. She passed away right in the middle of my accelerated nursing program. She passed away in January. I was in the middle of a nursing management course, which I had to withdraw from, and then took 21 credits, including 2 clinical days in my last semester to walk with the rest of my class in May. That was just 10 days after Shiva. but I did it. And I think the choice was right. For the first 2 years after becoming a nurse, I could not go into pediatrics just because of the effect that it had on me. But now I just celebrated 10 years in pediatric cardiology, and it was the right choice. And I'm doing and seeing patients that were much like my daughter. And so I cherish that I can give it from both sides of the bed, both as a nurse and as a parent who's gone through it. I can feel what those parents are feeling. I can also explain it better because I'm now on the medicine side of it. So yeah, I mean, but it was a long road, and there was challenges. I remember when I first started working at the hospital, one of the first few weeks of my orientation, they admitted a patient with almost identical diagnoses to Chana Ahuva. And we were doing the admission and getting the history, and I'm looking at this girl, and she looks not like my daughter, but she had blonde hair. She had the pump in her chest, and she had all this stuff. And I actually had to leave the room, and I had to catch myself. I remember, like, not a panic attack, but just overwhelming sadness.
Right.
So there's been stuff like that that's happened over the years, but like I say, because of her, I became what I am today. Certainly in profession, and I think also as a parent, but certainly in profession.
And so today you have. So what advice, to sort of sum things up? You've been through this experience. It seems like you said you're in total darkness. No one can relate to you. And now you're looking back and see how everything sort of fit together, although there's obviously still tremendous, there's that aspect of your life that feels like a dark corner. For everyone who's going through challenges, maybe this type challenge, the hardest challenge, or any challenge, I mean, what words of wisdom would you leave them with?
So it's different for each person. A lot of people like to think that God only gives me what I can handle. Right? I've heard that a lot. I wouldn't be going through this if God didn't think I couldn't handle it. But that doesn't always help us get through it. It's a nice mantra. It's something that we can say, but it doesn't really help you through the situation. You also have people say, you're going through these times because God really loves you. And then I always say, well, I wish God didn't love me so much.
Right.
It's like, he only tests you because he loves you. And I love that. Yeah, at its root, that's beautiful. But again, that doesn't help me. Doesn't help me process. Doesn't help me get through things. And it's like you said with the Navy SEALs. Like sometimes you just want to ring that bell. And you just want to be like, I'm out. But what keeps you going is there's no other way to describe it, is that like each morning getting out of bed and putting one foot in front of the other. If you look at life and you just go, it's too overwhelming. I can't. How am I going to live my next? I remember thinking the day she died, like I was what, 20, was it 12? I was 22 years old. I was 32 years old when she passed away. I was 32, and I have to live the next, 60 years without her. How can I do it? How can that? I say, Mashiach has to be coming like tomorrow, because there's no way. God knows I can't live 60 years without my daughter. It's like, it's not a possibility. And what I realize is that it's about baby steps. So don't look at it as my whole life of like impossible challenges. But if I can get through each day and do what I'm supposed to do and try to manage that day, then that's how I'm going to get through it. One of the things that my wife and I now we've turned to, and it's great if listeners haven't had the opportunity to like see these books. They're already up to like 6 or 7 of these books. They come in pocket size or large version. It's called Living Emunah. And
yes.
So they're like fantastic. And it's funny because he usually writes a story and then follows it with like a tidbit of how it affects Emunah or Bitachon. And what is unbelievable is you'll read a story. My wife and I like to do it on Friday nights or Shabbos. We'll do 1 or 2 at a time, because if you do too many, then it gets lost. It's like it doesn't have its meaning. One or you'll read it and you'll be like, what? This is exactly what we were like. This is what we were talking about. This is like just happened this week, and that's what you come to realize is like you're not alone.
Yeah.
Everyone do this. And
I've had that same experience reading that book where I'm like like talking to Hashem, like, you got to give me an answer. You got to give me an answer. And I'm just walking around my office and I'll sit down and I'll grab that and read the next chapter. And it's like, oh, thank you. It's like right there. It's like,
it's almost airy. It's almost airy. But we've found that like by having that in our back pocket where we can just like, okay, let's get a tidbit. We need redirection. We're getting overwhelmed. Let's read a little bit. Let's get recentered. And that's helped me a lot. And I think also for me is like I said, talked about a little bit about validation. For me, having my family, being able to talk openly, just how I'm feeling at the time I'm feeling it, rather than bottling it up or pushing it down or pushing it aside or making believe it's not there, it's not as healthy. In addition, always great to have a Rav or somebody in your life that you trust, that you know will give you sound advice that you can turn to and call and sit with, cry if you need to, explain, because the chances are you'll come out on the other side of that conversation with a lot more clarity and much less anxious.
beautiful. So recently you decided to begin a project of having a Sefer Torah written in her memory. And there's some background to why now. And if you could explain to the audience why you decided to do this at this point in time in Chana Ahuva's memory.
Okay. So there was a gentleman who lived here in Muncie who lost a child. It was very young, was an infant at the time, but he had the means and he was able to have a Sefer Torah written very early on. Again, it goes back many years. And after Chana Ahuva's passing, he was on me like a cheap suit. He would hound me. Avi, when are you writing a Sefer Torah? I'm like, I don't know. It's very hard. He's like, no. And one day he says to me, he goes, you will never get the type of closure you need until you're holding a Sefer Torah in your arms that was written in memory of your daughter. And that like hit me like, really? Like, wow. Because we know it's a huge mitzvah to have a Sefer Torah written and to be part of and write a Sefer Torah. But to have one and hold it and hug it and have it being taken out of and our whole lives, right, is all about the Torah. And so what greater blessing for her neshama would there be than to have it written that it's in her name and it's dedicated in her memory. And it shook me. And a bunch of things came together in the last few months. She would have turned 18. Her English birthday was August 28th. Her Hebrew birthday was Daled Elul. She would have been 18 years old. And there is a saying, Shmona Esra Lechuppah, that at 18 years old, you should start pushing your children towards marriage. And I'll never get that opportunity with her. I'll never be able to walk her down the aisle to chuppah. And so I thought, you know what? She would have been 18 now. What better time than to try to raise money for a Sefer Torah where we can at least, in her 18th year, walk a Sefer Torah down under a chuppah in her place, and have that forever as an eternal memory for her. This gentleman who had been pushing me to write the Sefer Torah, he passed away in March of this past year of 2024. And in conjunction with that, I felt like, I don't know, like I owed it to him. He was so on me for it, to do it. And some said to me, oh, maybe you should have done it closer to when she passed, because then it would have been fresher and people would be more willing to give. And I said, listen, it's going to be in her schus, in her memory. So I'm hoping that, people will give regardless of whether they know her or they know me or they know the cause. And that's why we did it now. And I can only hope that we raise the funds and we're successful.
That's beautiful. I just, as you were talking, I clicked on the link you gave me for the donation page so I could see her beautiful smile.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to make a donation. It's a tremendous mitzvah. And for any of you listening who would like to fulfill the mitzvah of, contributing towards the writing of Sefer Torah in the memory, Chana Ahuva, click in the show notes. You'll see the link there that you can make a contribution to this amazing cause. Avi, is there anything else you would like to share with the audience?
No, they should know that the campaign is through a 501c3, so all that is tax deductible, any donation they make to the campaign. But no one should have to go through the loss of a child. But I feel like, again, it changed who I am. It made me who I am in many ways. I don't know how my life would have been had she still been here, or what would have been different. I only know what it is and what I hope to look forward to at some point when we have a reunion. But whether it's the loss of a child or anything that somebody's going through in their lives that's painful, just remember that you're not alone. You're really not alone. And sometimes it'll feel like no one else gets you, and there's no one else in your circle, and you're really fighting this by yourself. But you'd be surprised if you looked around, and there's always someone there who's willing to help you and listen. So I think that's something to keep close and remember.
Beautiful. Avi, thank you so much. I know it was probably difficult to do, to sort of discuss something that was so painful for you, but I know I learned a great deal. I know the audience did as well. And so on behalf of the audience too, we all appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting Torch so they can continue to spread Torah wisdom to the world by making a donation at torchweb.org and clicking donate in the top right corner of the page.